Let's go down to Texas. There's a man there from the central area who served 20 years for a murder that he said he didn't commit. And it appears that, at least based on his argument and what we've seen, that the police had no credible evidence that he committed the murder. Since his release from prison nearly 4 years ago, the man is still fighting to clear his name and hopefully receive a full exoneration. So this man, his name is Edward Yates. Now he is 54. This is a photo of him here. Well, back in July 1993, he was just about a 25-year-old living next to a woman named Elnora Griffin, who was stabbed to death. And during her murder, essentially, the murderer grabbed her by the neck and she lost control of her bowels. The killer ended up stepping on her feces, leaving a footprint that was later used against Mr. Yates during his trial. Now, here's what we know, courtesy of the Atlanta Black Star. Yates says police based their case on feces found on his shoe. He was arrested and charged with Griffin's murder, and although he was released from jail on bond a few months later, his trial didn't take place until July of '96. In that trial, the judge declared the case a mistrial. In August of '98, prosecutors tried Yates again, focusing on the feces, except this time the jury was all white and Yates was found guilty, sentenced to 99 years in prison. In 2015, Yates got a second life after the Truth and Justice podcast took an interest in his case. The podcast host, Bob Ruff, contacted Yates and the two forged a friendship, although Yates admits he was reluctant and skeptical at first, fearing Ruff was a solicitor with the initial contact. Ruff also got the Texas Innocence Project involved in the case, and he said, "I'm going to get you out of here. It may take me a while, but I know you didn't do this, and I'm gonna help you," Yates said he told Ruff. And so through the Texas Innocence Project, there were attorneys who began to investigate his case, and that attorney Clayton was drawn to the case in part because of the lack of any kind of objective evidence most crime scenes will contain, especially crime scenes as violent as this one. Now, Clayton worked to prove Yates' innocence, and she got the Smith County District Attorney to agree to retesting the feces on his shoe. And then we can come back to the DNA testing all these years later and say definitively that it's not Elnora on the bottom of that shoe. And once that happens, you have zero evidence biologically putting Ed at the scene of the crime. After the Texas Innocence Project, that independent DNA test couldn't pin Yates to the feces believed to be from Griffin. The tide began to turn in Yates' favor as Clayton worked on the forensics of Yates' case, and the podcast lobbied too by asking listeners to send in letters. Yates was denied parole twice previously because he refused to admit to a crime, and he says he didn't commit it. This time around, the added support and granted him enough support from the parole board and his release from prison. Now, since being released on parole, Yates was reunited with his son and daughter and his wife. He also uses his experience with the justice system to help steer young Black boys away from trouble through mentorship and a mutual love of basketball. But I'd like to talk about a mutual love of money and the fact that they wasted this man's life by convicting him based on this shoddy evidence out there. And now I love money too, and he needs to be paid for that. But an exoneration would probably be required for that actually to happen because they took years off of his life. And so what can we do in terms of getting Texas to act right and be right? Ben, thoughts?
Yeah, this is just infuriating, right? Like this is another instance of, there's this whole meme among people who like true crime podcasts that police never really solve the crime. It's always like family members or something that actually end up doing the investigation. But here's an instance where you have a podcast that, kudos to the people on the podcast, but ultimately this should be the job of the government. But the government's not doing this. The government doesn't care, because let's be real. They don't care, right? If they're throwing innocent Black folks into prison, fundamentally they don't care, because our entire system was literally built around the dehumanization of Black folks, and especially the criminalization of Black men. So they're not really interested in guilt or innocence. They're just looking to throw somebody in jail. And there's like a ton of examples of this around the country where whenever there's something like a car robbery or like a burglary or something, you have police officers that will use a recent incident to justify basically harassing any random Black person that they see on the street and just accusing them with a crime. How many times do we have to see police officers say that somebody fit the description and there's only one detail that really they seem to pay attention to in the description?
Yeah, for real. And you took 20 years from this man, if not more. This is just something that I couldn't fathom. Essentially being caged like an animal and accused of something you did not do. Also, the fact that he had to go through 2 trials and it only was when he had an all-white jury is when he got convicted. The least the state could do is to look into this and to make it right. We're seeing states waste and squander money in all different ways, means, and now they can't even use it to rectify taking away a man's life. Yeah. Like that is injustice and that is wrong and it is extremely problematic and something we can't have. And so I commend Ates and everyone who is working on his behalf to make sure that the man gets justice.